Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Brad Roberts, Director of the Center for Global Security Research, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session with Dr. Thomas Mankin, who is President and CEO of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, and who will be talking today on competitive strategies, theory, and practice. Before introducing Tom, let me say a few words about the context here. It's widely accepted, of course, that we've entered a new era of strategic competition and rivalry with Russia and China. And it's widely recognized that we need to organize strategy, policy, and plans in a manner that advances U.S. interests and those of our allies and partners in this new environment. But it's clear that there's been a dearth of new thinking on how to do so. We've been debating as a nation at the grand strategy level for a decade now, how to compete more effectively, what goals to compete for, whether this is mostly a science and technology problem or it's an overall military balance problem. We've been debating the nature of the problem that we're competing about. Faced with a similar problem in the Cold War, analysts developed a set of ideas about how to compete over the long term to gradually shift the competition to U.S. advantage. And these ideas came together under the rubric of competitive strategies. Today's speaker is one of perhaps the nation's leading authority on competitive strategies. He authored a book on the subject, now a decade old. Tom, it's time for edition 2, on competitive strategies for the 21st century, theory, history, and practice. And what we've asked Tom to do today is to discuss both the theory and practices of competitive strategies. He's going to do so with some case studies and then explore implications for how to compete today with China and Russia. Dr. Thomas G. Mankin is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, as I've already said. He is also a senior research professor at the Philip Merrill Center for Strategic Studies at Johns Hopkins University's Nitze School of Advanced International Studies. He currently also serves as a member of the congressionally mandated National Defense Strategy Commission and as a member of the Army Science Board. He served previously as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy Planning. This was from 2006 to 2009. And he taught previously for 2 decades at the U.S. Naval War College, where he served as the Jerome Levy Chair of Economics, Geography, and National Security. He's a Californian. We're pleased to welcome you back virtually. Summa cum laude graduate of the University of Southern California with bachelor's degrees in history and international relations and a certificate in defense and strategic studies. And he received his master's degree and doctorate in international affairs from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where he now teaches. Tom's going to make introductory remarks with some slides of approximately 45 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A. We encourage people to raise their hands electronically and join the conversation in person. Please don't wait until the beginning of the Q&A portion to raise your hands. But if you'd rather submit something in the chat function, I'll do my best to get it into play in the time available. Tom, thanks so much for making the time to do this with us today. Thanks so much for your leadership on these questions. Over to you.
Brad, thanks so much. Always good to see you. Unfortunately, only in 2 dimensions this time. Really appreciate the opportunity. And Katie, thanks so much for all your help in getting this set up. Yeah, and I also appreciate Brad, your injunction on Q&A. Having moderated plenty of webinars myself, I know the dynamics that that tend to take hold. And look, it's a pleasure to be with all of you again, albeit virtually today. I really would rather have been there in 3 dimensions, but as I was telling Brad and Katie before we started, this so-called summer has kind of closed in on me. So yeah, let me start with my remarks. And as Brad said, and as the title shows, this is really about, theory and practice of competitive strategies because each is important. I think the theory is important, and I'd like to equip you in the time that we have with some frameworks, some tools to think about competing in peacetime, but also the practice, right? I mean, theory divorced from practice is not really very useful. So I want to draw not just on the U.S. experience in the Cold War, but also the experience of Great Britain in competing with Imperial Germany at the turn of the 20th century, because I think we can, overlearn the lessons of the Cold War, or we can, kind of particularize them. So I'd like to give a little bit broader sense of things. So let me share my slides. Screen is telling me that I'm sharing, so presumably everything looks.
Indeed, we're good to go.
Okay, good. Always good to get the confirmation. So I'd actually, since the topic is about competitive strategy, I'd really like to just start with what my definition of strategy is. Realizing that there are other folks, friends, colleagues that have different definitions. This is mine. I think it's an utterly defensible one, and it really does lead into our main topic. So for me, strategy is about how to array limited resources in space and time to achieve your aims against a competitor. So I like this definition because it draws our attention to several key facts. Resources are always limited, whether it's us, whether it's our competitor. And as we'll talk about, a recognition of the limits of those resources really is central to developing good strategy. So strategy about how to array those limited resources in space and in time, right? It's not just where you put those resources, but when you put those resources. And as I'll talk about in a couple minutes, in peacetime competition, I'd say that time dimension is particularly important. And then, so strategies about how to array limited resources in space and time to achieve your aims, right? So this is about achieving your objectives, and then against a competitor, right? So interaction with a competitor, in my view, is really, is so central to strategy. It really is one of the essential features of strategy. So that's a sort of an overall definition of strategy. Now, that having been said, you see the repeated here, that overall master definition. Strategy can look very different in peace and in war, and in short wars and in protracted wars. In short wars, to paraphrase the late Donald Rumsfeld, you go to war with the army you have, not the army you wish you had. And it was funny when Rumsfeld said that, a lot of people kind of made fun of him. I could never quite figure that out because, in fact, well, A, he was right, and B, it's actually a very insightful point, which is that in peacetime, militaries may place bets against an uncertain future. And it's only when war comes that you find out whether those bets have been good bets or colossally bad bets, right? So in short wars, you fight with your existing military. And to take a historical metaphor, you would rather not be France in May of 1940, right? France in the 1920s, 1930s placed all sorts of bets towards an uncertain future. Those wound up being bad bets, and it wound up being a short war. So France didn't have an opportunity to recoup those bets. Now, in protracted wars, you do have opportunities. You do have opportunities to move chips around on the board, for example, metaphorically speaking. And the material dimension of strategy becomes more important because it's what allows you to do that, right? And we see that unfolding today in Ukraine as both Russia and Ukraine are adapting, and they're doubling down on some bets, and they're liquidating other bets. So even in wartime, strategy can look different depending on whether you face a short war or a protracted war. And of course, in peacetime, you're never quite sure what that war is going to look like. So in long-term peacetime competitions, uh, I argue that the economic dimension is even more important because it's what gives you the resources, the financial resources, the technological resources, the human resources to place those bets that will pay off or not in time of war. So the master definition of strategy applies, but strategy can look very different in peace and in war. And what I really want to focus on for the remainder of this conversation is strategy in peacetime, and otherwise known as, competitive strategies. Some people will argue that the term competitive strategies is itself a redundancy, right? Because as I just showed you, my definition of strategy includes competition, right? So sort of like the term, it's like the term competitive strategies comes from the Department of Redundancy department. Competition is already inherent in strategy. Fact is, though, that the term comes to us really from the business community. So if we want to blame somebody, we can blame Harvard Business School because they were the folks who first came up with this idea or this concept, this term, competitive strategies. And that was then imported into the Defense Department and then kind of the scholarly community. But if we think about competitive strategies as being competition in peacetime, there really are a handful of features that come to the fore. First has to do with the aims. Remember back to my definition of strategy, how to achieve your aims against an adversary. In peacetime, you generally seek limited aims. In other words, you seek to change a competitor's decision-making calculus rather than overthrow that competitor. Right? So that's one thing. So peacetime strategy is generally about realizing limited aims, changing a competitor's decision-making calculus, changing a competitor's mental state. Second, competitive strategies can and often do involve the use of military assets, right? But the focus of competition is on the latent use of force to coerce or deter, rather than overt use of force, right? To invade or to overthrow or to bomb, kill. And because of that, a key consideration in peacetime is what to conceal and when versus what to show and when. And there's certainly been a growing interest in this topic, certainly in DoD, this conceal reveal dynamic. And I would just point out at this point that that is a real consideration in peacetime. In wartime, less so, right? In wartime, it's much more about using the capabilities that you have, using even capabilities that have been concealed during peacetime to operational strategic effect. In peacetime, you really do have to think about what to conceal versus what to reveal. You conceal something, right, to preserve its operational effectiveness, particularly perishable capabilities, and you reveal things in order to deter. Any one of us who's seen in the great work of strategy, Dr. Strangelove, knows that a capability like the Soviet doomsday machine portrayed in Dr. Strangelove, which the Soviets in that movie concealed, by definition can't deter, right? And we can talk about what the Soviets actually did, which was kind of scarily close to what happened in Doctor Strangelove, or what they did in Doctor Strangelove. But this conceal reveal dynamic really is important. Third, we need to acknowledge that strategy in peacetime contends with a greater degree of uncertainty than strategy in wartime. That has to do with the peacetime environment, and really, military forces in peacetime. There's always going to be a kind of a cloud of uncertainty over what goes on. Similarly, we need to contend with the fact that the tolerance for risk among decision makers is generally lower in peace than in war. And I think we can certainly see that even in the U.S. case when it comes to our behavior regarding Russia and Ukraine before the war, and now, in the year and a half since the war's been going on. And then finally, back to that time dimension, it takes longer to determine the effects of strategy in peace than in war, right? In war, you can usually judge success or failure in, well, sometimes seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, months. In peacetime, often it's years or perhaps a large number of years. So just as I had a handful of characteristics of peacetime strategy, here's a handful of considerations in formulating a competitive strategy. First, you need a concrete, and I have here a sophisticated opponent. And so again, based on my definition, you develop strategy against a particular opponent. Strategy is opponent specific for reasons that we'll see in just a couple of minutes. But you do need a concrete opponent. And when I say a sophisticated opponent, I just mean an opponent that is bureaucratized enough, organized enough that it has a regular set of behaviors, standard operating procedures, organizational culture, bureaucratic routines. And for strategy making purposes, that's a fairly low bar. I mean, certainly Russia, China, North Korea, Iran clear that bar. So do, I would say, major non-state actors, Hezbollah, Islamic State, Al-Qaeda. They all clear that bar. But you do need to have a concrete and sophisticated opponent. Second, crucially, and something that can't be assumed, you need to have a sufficient understanding of the competitor to formulate and implement strategies. And I can't emphasize that enough. And that's something that comes over time. It can't be wished into being. It takes time. And as I'll argue in a minute, it also takes action to actually develop that understanding of the competitor. But you need that knowledge. Third, and this gets back to limits and limits on resources, you need to have a recognition that each side's choices are constrained. I think it's a very normal human tendency to look at ourselves and realize all the constraints that we face. But too often when we look out at others, we ignore the constraints that they face. Good strategy really comes from understanding not only our own constraints, but also those of our competitors. Fourth, back to this issue of time. Good strategy should account for time and make it a virtue. Good strategy should put time on our side. And then finally, good strategy should, it's really a sum of all this, should account for interaction with our competitor over time. And again, should try to drive that interaction in a positive direction for us. So let me give you a graphic thing. It's my only graphic in this presentation. The point of it is that ideally we should think in developing strategy, we should think in terms of a 3-move sequence. And I have that portrayed here, right? Oftentimes it's difficult enough to formulate your own strategy. That's that first kind of gray arrow on top. But if you're thoughtful about it, you should also take into account your adversary's response. That's the red arrow below. But my point is that you should also be thinking at your next move. You really should be thinking about this in a 3-move sequence. And I have this portrayed as an ongoing set of interactions. As you'll see, there's a posited red move kind of at the very beginning of the sequence, and then at the end of this 3-move sequence, you see there's another move. And the point there is, for planning purposes, we should be thinking about this as a set of interactions going on over time. And again, these interactions are likely, if we're to actually specify on the time axis, you really are talking about years here. So you could think about this going on for some period of time. The other thing I'd like you to take from this this portrayal is that this interaction is not just about trying to achieve your aims, but it's also about gaining knowledge of your adversary. And so here, I'd like to speed up the time constant and shift our focus a little bit, and let's put this into a sports context. And here, I will draw a metaphor to a non-combat sport, but the probably non-combat sport that's closest to being a combat sport, and that's tennis. Um, I'm actually a terrible tennis player, but I get the idea, and I think a lot of people get the idea. So I think it's a good metaphor. So imagine that you and I are going to compete, right? We're going to play tennis against one another. We've never met, we've never, let alone, played tennis with one another. You and I show up on opposite ends of the tennis court, and immediately we start to size each other up. How tall are you, or how tall am I? How short am I? Am I left-handed, right-handed? By the way, I'm left-handed. We start to draw basic conclusions about our competitor, right? Do I have a new tennis racket, or does it look like something I fished out of my parents' attic? Do I have the right shoes, or do I look like, or am I wearing like sandals? And you're going to draw some basic conclusions about me as a competitor. Now we start playing, right? We start volleying back and forth, and you gain, as we interact, right? You start to gain more insight into me as a competitor. What are the things that I'm good at? What are the things that I'm bad at? What are the things that I like to do? What are the things that I avoid doing? And then if you're good, and this is all about being a good strategist, you figure out ways to exploit my weaknesses, and particularly to pit your strengths against my weaknesses. So if you've got a really strong serve and I'm not very mobile, you're going to force me to run back and forth across the court, chasing your serves left and right, right? So that's interaction in a sporting context, right? And except in tennis, that's minutes, hours, right? Where that goes on. Here we're talking about in a much more expanded time frame, but the principle still holds. It's a competition to achieve aims, but as part of that, it's a competition to gain and exploit knowledge of the adversary. Now, so far, I've been talking about competitive strategies as just as a thing. Now what I'd like to do is break it down into a set of families of peacetime strategy. And here I owe a great debt to my former Naval War College colleague, Bradley, who's just written some very, very thoughtful things upon this. And I really owe an intellectual debt to Brad. Here, we have four families of strategy, and they're characterized by they're distinct but not mutually exclusive. In other words, you can have a strategy that has elements of cost imposition and attacking your strategy, but they're distinct because of the effect that they seek to have upon an adversary. So a strategy of denial seeks to convince the adversary that it's impossible for that adversary to achieve his objectives. Impossible. By contrast, a strategy of cost imposition seeks to convince that adversary that it would be unprofitable for them to achieve their objectives. Not impossible, but that the costs of achieving those ends would be far outweighed, or sorry, the benefits of achieving those ends would be far outweighed by the costs. And as we think about costs, I would urge us all to be broad-minded, right? Not just to think about economic costs, but to think about other types of costs as well. And here I just have a couple of slides. Even if we think about economic costs, we can think about monetary costs, right? Inducing a competitor to spend lots on capabilities, perhaps even creating sort of guns versus butter trade-offs. You can also think about human resources costs, inducing an adversary to overtax critical human resources. And And I would say in the nuclear field, I think whether it's the United States or other countries, those critical human resources when it comes to nuclear engineering, nuclear physics. I mean, those are scarce resources, and one can think about all sorts of ways of imposing costs upon an adversary in the human resources domain when it comes to, say, a nuclear program. We could talk about that more if you want. And then you could also think about technology costs. Really, I mean, from my perspective, just about every tech transfer regime out there has a cost imposition rationale. In other words, we try to restrict access to technology to countries of concern. Well, ideally to deny them that technology, back to the strategy of denial. But oftentimes, if denial fails, we force them to undertake costly technology development indigenously that hopefully leads to, if it even leads to anything, leads to kind of a second best solution. So even in technology transfer, you can see a cost imposition rationale. Um, and then if we go beyond economic costs to, say, military costs, you can see there's various ways to impose efficiency and effectiveness costs on an adversary. And then finally, I think often overlooked, political or diplomatic cost imposition. And I think these are an important part of the equation. They may not be as long lasting as some of these other approaches, but I think to overlook them would be a real mistake. So when we think about cost imposition, we really should think broadly. Now, if denial's about convincing an adversary that it would be impossible for them to achieve their aims, and cost imposition is about convincing them that it would be unprofitable to do so, attacking your adversary's strategy is all about convincing your adversary that the assumptions that underpin their existing strategy are unwarranted or unrealistic, and forcing them to kind of go back to the drawing board to develop a new strategy. And then the fourth family, and don't worry, I'll illustrate all of these families in a few minutes. The fourth family of peacetime strategy is about attacking your adversary's political system, and that's about using the features of your adversary's political system, whether it's just sort of the ingrained features or the factions of your opponent's political system, using those features against them. And again, I'll have some historical illustrations to maybe make more sense out of that. So as we think about peacetime strategy or think about competitive strategies, there's a number of different specific strategies or approaches that we can take. Now, regardless of what approach we take, I think it's important to think about measures of effectiveness, right? How do we know that we're doing a good, the right thing? How do we know whether we're succeeding or not? Particularly when you're talking about the uncertainties of peacetime, and particularly when you're thinking about interaction that will likely stretch over years or perhaps even decades. So here are three sets of measures of effectiveness. So one way to measure success is in terms of options. Broadly speaking, if we're doing well, then we should be buying ourselves options over time. Our set of options should be growing, and our competitors' options should be shrinking. Conversely, if we're not doing well, then we should expect to see our set of options shrink and those of our competitor expand. A second way to measure effectiveness is through costs. And again, I want us to think about costs expansively. But if we're doing well, we should prevent an adversary from imposing costs upon us, and we should impose costs upon our competitors. Not doing well, conversely, we should see ourselves bearing more and more costs from an adversary, and whereas we're not imposing costs on them. And then finally, I come to this idea of momentum, and here I want us to think back to that tennis metaphor that I mentioned a few minutes ago. if we are doing well, then our competitors should be reacting to us. We should be exerting control over the pace and scope of the competition. Conversely, if we're not doing well, then we should we should not be surprised if we find ourselves reacting to our adversary, and our adversary is the one who's exerting control over the pace and scope of the competition. So think of me playing tennis against Venus Williams or Serena Williams or probably anybody named Williams. I'm going to be the one on the short end of that competition. But basic point is we should be thinking about measures of effectiveness. Okay, so much for the theory. Now let's conclude with a discussion of the practice of competitive strategy. And I wanted to start, I'll spend a little bit more time on the Cold War for two reasons. That first, it involves the United States. So for those who are skeptical that the United States can do strategy, here's an example where the United States did strategy. And also it's and a United States that's more or less like the United States of today. It's also more proximate. But I want to actually lead with the case of the Anglo-German arms competition, the Anglo-German naval rivalry at the dawn of the 20th century, because it shows that I think it highlights some of the features that I've talked about, and it's again, I don't want us to overlearn from the Cold War. It's also it's not a 21st century liberal democracy against a 21st century authoritarian state, but it's two constitutional monarchies going at it. So let's talk about that. So the Anglo-German naval competition, I'd like to talk a little bit about that, and particularly featuring cost imposition and attacking the adversary's political system. So Anglo-German naval rivalry came about as Imperial Germany sought to challenge Great Britain as a global power and as a naval power, and as Germany devoted increasing parts of its defense expenditure and a growing defense expenditure to battleships, to battleship construction, for global access, for prestige, ultimately to really try to displace Great Britain as a great power. Britain, as the established power, undertook a very coherent strategy for competing with this rising German naval threat. And I think that the two elements that I'd like to emphasize in a competitive strategies perspective are cost imposition and attacking the adversary's political system. Now, the approach that Britain took was really codified in a strategy that Admiral Sir John Fisher, Jackie Fisher, titled Plunging, which I think it's kind of a weird. It's not an obvious title, but that's what he chose. This is really what he meant. So here's a quote from Jackie Fisher, and then there's a portrait of Jackie Fisher on the right. Here was Britain's basic strategy for the Anglo-German naval rivalry. You see all your rivals' plans fully developed, their vessels started beyond recall, and then in each individual answer to each such rival vessel, you plunge with a design that is 50% better, knowing that your rapid shipbuilding and command of money will enable you to have your vessels fit to fight as soon, if not sooner, than the rival vessel. That was Britain's approach. Britain's approach to the Anglo-German naval rivalry was not actually to be a leader, but to be a fast follower. And so basically let Germany make the first move, let Germany commit to battleship construction or construction of a battleship of a certain class, and then counter it in such a way that it would make it obsolete. So as you see, there is a cost imposition element to this, both economic costs, manpower costs, talent costs, time costs. But then also there's actually an element of this that really relied on Britain's ability to to anticipate German moves and to act faster. And here, this is one of the things that highlights, I think, so the cost imposition element of this should be fairly obvious, fairly straightforward, is right here in the quote. The time dimension, or the attacking the adversary's political system, requires us to actually step back a little bit, and actually maybe rethink whatever preconceptions we have about Great Britain and Imperial Germany. Because the fact is that Great Britain, then actually as now, was actually able to respond pretty quickly to challenges, and also was, and I'd say actually is, a fairly opaque system to outsiders. Conversely, I don't know, again, whatever stereotypes we have about Imperial Germany or Germany overall, the German governmental system leading up to World War I was actually had to be very transparent. So a lot of the power rested in the states, and had a fairly weak central government. What that meant was, when it came to budgeting, when it came to defense planning, the Germans had to basically show the world their cards. They had to be very explicit about what they were laying down, or what they intended to lay down in terms of battleships, as part of making the case for budget, for resources in the federal legislature. Britain, meanwhile, could step back, watch Germany display its hand, and then plan accordingly. So Britain not only took advantage of its industrial base in shipbuilding, its expertise in shipbuilding, but the very nature of the British political system relative to the German political system in conducting this arms competition. And it's interesting in historical retrospect. I think oftentimes we think of ourselves more like the Brits. Actually, in some cases, we actually probably behave more like the Germans in this case, in terms of showing our hand to the world, and letting them respond to us. So those are a couple of key elements of the British strategy against Germany, and it was a very successful strategy. I think, frankly, Britain had won the Anglo-German naval arms race long before World War I came along, and I think World War I kind of demonstrated that. But this was a competition that was ultimately won in peacetime, and ultimately won when Germany decided, as it did before World War I, to turn away from arms competition with Britain and really focus much more on continental Europe. And you could see that with a shift in resources away from the German Navy, from the Kriegsmarine, and towards the German Army. And so, again, back to measures of effectiveness, you can see how the Germans basically conceded this competition even before World War I came. All right, now let me conclude with some illustrations from the Cold War, and something that's probably more familiar to many of us. And here I'll give illustrations of each of the four families of competitive strategy, some at greater length than others. Starting with denial, right? And I think if we think about NATO doctrine in Europe during the Cold War, it was a doctrine of denial. It was conventional and nuclear forces aimed at convincing the Soviet leadership that it was impossible for them to invade Central Europe, because if they did, they would ultimately face nuclear retaliation. So it would not just about costs, but it would be ultimately impossible for them to to invade Central Europe. So clearly an element of denial in U.S. strategy against the Soviet Union. The case of cost imposition, the canonical case that I'd like to discuss for a few minutes is that of U.S. bombers, specifically U.S. manned penetrating bombers against Soviet air defenses. And I think it's a good illustration for how cost imposition can unfold over the course of decades. So if you'll indulge me, I'm going to go into this case in a little bit of detail. 'Cause again, there's some good empirical historical data. And let's start with basic predispositions, right? The Soviets had, Russia still has, a deep predisposition to protect the homeland. It's not a surprising predisposition given Soviet history, and certainly, from the perspective of the early Cold War, very proximate, very painful historical experience of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. But that historical experience was backed by organizational politics when the Soviet Union actually stood up a whole service aimed at the basically aerospace defense, or the air and missile defense of the Soviet homeland. So you have historical experience, you have organizational politics, and then you have resources. I mean, the Soviets spent between 0.5% and 1% of GNP, not on defense, but just on the homeland defense mission. So clearly something that they cared about. On the U.S. side, the Air Force certainly cared about strategic aviation, but even the Army Air Corps, before it became the U.S. Air Force, cared about strategic aviation, cared about manned bombing going back to the 20s and 30s. And unconsciously, and then later consciously, you see that turn to competitive advantage. And here I've got a chronology that I just want to go through briefly to highlight the interaction. Starting with, the establishment of Strategic Air Command, development of the B-52 on the U.S. side, right? B-52 originally developed as a high altitude intercontinental bomber. That was the initial idea for the B-52. And then you see almost immediately a response from the Soviets in the elevation of PVO-strany to a service, again, a service dedicated to homeland defense, and the deployment of the first generation of Soviet surface-to-air missiles that were designed to shoot down high-altitude bombers. So the game is on, right? The interaction is on. You see then the next U.S. move from the mid-50s to the mid-60s. First in a shift to low-level attack tactics for bombers to counter the Soviet surface-to-air missiles, and the development of the Hound Dog air-to-surface missile to allow the bombers to launch their weapons outside the defensive envelope of the Soviet SAMs. And then followed by the development of the FB-111 theater bomber, again, low-altitude penetrating bomber, the B-1 bomber, again, low-altitude penetrating bomber, and the development of the short-range attack missile and air-launched cruise missile, again, to allow launch outside of the defensive envelope of the Soviets. Now let's take a look at this, right? So we had Soviet moves in the early to mid 1950s. You have a set of U.S. responses that begin in the mid 1950s. It's not until really the 1980s that the Soviet response to that U.S. move really becomes manifest in the deployment of the SA-10 surface-to-air missile, designed, among other things, to shoot down low-altitude penetrating bombers, cruise missiles, and the deployment of the MiG-23 interceptor with true sort of look-down, shoot-down capability to be able to pick out bombers and cruise missiles against the background clutter of the ground. So think about that. Again, let's think about that in time. You basically have a U.S. move, and it's basically a quarter century for the Soviet response to begin manifesting itself. Then the U.S. moves on to the next move, deployment of the B-1B with improved electronic countermeasures, but really key is the deployment of the first B-2 bomber, Stealth, and to really, among other things, to impose costs. And you don't have to believe me. You can believe former Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger in his annual report to Congress for fiscal year 1988. Part of the rationale for Stealth wasn't just operational effectiveness, but also cost imposition. And that cost imposition rationale was part of what drove the decision to reveal the existence of Stealth, which was was developed in a series of highly classified programs, some special access programs. And just a couple of those programs, the results of those programs are actually shown over there on the right. We can talk more about that if you'd like. But that cost imposition rationale really was important. Now, in revealing Stealth, decision makers faced a key question, and it gets back to this question of conceal versus reveal. Did it make sense to reveal Stealth, and in so doing, basically start the stopwatch for a Soviet response, or would it make sense for the to keep Stealth as a highly classified program to preserve its operational utility? And here, this gets back to the importance of information or intelligence, right? Here, decision makers were aided by a deep understanding of the Soviet research, development, and acquisition system. And here, portrayed in a declassified intelligence assessment on Soviet work on RCS reduction. Work that was informed by, among other things, information provided by the gentleman you see on the right, Adolf Tolkachev, who was in the part of the Soviet engineering enterprise that was dedicated to radar and radar cross-section, stealth, counter-stealth. And it was insights from Tolkachev and presumably from others and from other sources that if the Soviets did have a stealth program underway, it was probably in the very early stages, and also understanding of the Soviet research, development, acquisition system, that it would not be deployed until the 1990s. And so understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of the Soviet RDA system gave decision makers confidence in revealing the existence of stealth. Again, a good case of cost imposition here. I've got various ways of measuring costs imposed. One is just dollars. Another is in terms of resource diversion towards defensive systems, SAMs, anti-aircraft artillery systems, single-purpose air defense aircraft, and then as sort of a bonus, the MiG-25 interceptor, which was developed to counter not just the XB-70, but was developed to counter a whole family of high-speed, high-altitude aircraft that the U.S. was developing, but more or less didn't deploy. And then finally, certainly increased uncertainty in doctrine and forces. So that's a discussion of cost imposition. Let me conclude my comments with attacking your adversary's strategy and attacking their political system. Attacking your adversary's strategy. Good example there is air-land battle. And I'll just briefly go through it, but happy to talk further in Q&A. Basic notion there was to render obsolete the assumptions that the Soviets had about a future war with NATO. And the Soviets, for a whole bunch of reasons, organizational culture, even like alliance politics, the nature of the Soviet system, had a very echeloned and scripted approach to doctrine, and relied upon forces approaching the forward line of battle to be able to echelon and kind of maintain their cohesion. And air-land battle really attacked that through the development of precision munitions, long-range targeting, command and control, and really did call into question and forced the Soviet general staff to call into question their assumptions about a U.S.-Soviet conflict. And again, we can talk more about it in Q&A. They kind of had to go back to the drawing board. It's interesting to speculate how it might have played out if the Cold War hadn't ended, but that's a good example there. The one I'd like to end with is another one of these cases of attacking your adversary's political system. And this one has to do with SDI. And if we go back to the concept of advantages or strengths versus weaknesses, SDI certainly exploited U.S. advantage in advanced technology. And in this case, there was actually a deception program that was designed to accentuate Soviet perceptions of that technological advantage. It did have a cost imposition element to it in that it sought to render obsolete the tremendous Soviet investment in ballistic missiles, and particularly in their heavy ICBMs, which were particularly problematic for us. But then there was a notion that even if it was only partially effective, it would increase uncertainty and bolster deterrence. And again, we can talk more about that. What we now know, and it's important to say what we now know, what we didn't know at the time. So this is not, this gets back to the importance of information. What we now know is that the Soviets really had a major response to SDI. And that response came in response not just to the kind of the general technological gap between the US and the Soviet Union, but demonstrations of US capability, including the January 1984 homing overlay experiment, which did have a deception component to it. It was basically rigged to succeed, and it was rigged to show the Soviets that a lot of missile defense technologies were actually just right around the corner, when actually maybe they really weren't. But it did have its desired effect of triggering a Soviet response. And here you see a sense of just the magnitude of that response. 137 RDT&E programs, 34 applied research programs, 115 basic research programs. And it really did provoke a debate, a discussion within the Soviet leadership over whether it made sense to try to carry out a high-tech arms race with the United States or seek other approaches to competing, such as through arms control, such as through political warfare, funding peace groups, things like that. And that debate really came to a head surrounding the test of this. This is a photo from the Soviet archives. I love it because it's so Soviet. I mean, only the Soviets would paint their the test module for their space-based laser battle station. Only they would paint it black. Only the Soviets would have in big white letters "Mir," which means both world and peace. Have the word peace on a big black laser battle station. But anyway, this is a photo of the demonstration module of a system known as SCIF or Polyus. And SCIF or Polyus began its life as a laser ASAT, but because of the problems the Soviets, well, problems everybody had with high-powered lasers in the 1970s, it really became a laser blinder. And so the black battle station here doesn't actually contain a laser. It contains a kind of a weight and balance mock-up of the laser blinder. And it was designed to be launched into low Earth orbit, reorient itself, boost itself up into a high Earth orbit, and then maneuver and track US satellite assets, just as a demonstrator of the ability to acquire and track US satellites, and then presumably with a functional laser to be able to blind them. Unfortunately, what happened in this case was whoever coded the flight software for the SCIF DM mixed up some ones and zeros. And so what in fact happened was it boosted itself into low Earth orbit, reoriented itself downward, and then plunged itself back into the Earth's atmosphere, incinerating itself. And I'm metaphorically incinerating the arguments of those in the Soviet leadership who argued in favor of a high-tech arms race with the United States. And it's not as if the Soviets conceded on SDI. Rather, what they really sought to do from there on out was to contest SDI mainly through political warfare, arms control, peace groups, things like that. So it's just an example of how U.S. actions, kind of almost like a pinball machine or a pachinko machine, kind of caromed off the features of the Soviet leadership and had an impact. My argument is not that this was all a conscious U.S. strategy, by the way. Merely it's just to demonstrate how these things can actually play out in real life. So look, I'm just going to conclude with just some contrasts between the Cold War and today, right? And they're here on this slide. I think we can overlearn the lessons of the Soviet Union, but I think we would also be mistaken to ignore those lessons, right? There's a lot of similarities. There's a lot that we can learn from the Cold War for today's situation, whether it's about China or Russia. But again, we need to be mindful of the differences as well. And then we also need to be mindful of caveats. To be successful, you need to have a long-term view. You need to have a degree of focus. You need to develop a deep understanding of the competitor, and that takes time and resources. And you need coordinated action. So finally, what do you need to do? You need to identify your enduring strengths and weaknesses and those of your competitor. You need to develop capabilities for peacetime competition, but also warfighting, right? The two are distinct but related. And you need to plan for interaction over time, but also keep in mind the unexpected. So with that, let me stop my share. And hopefully I've said enough that is interesting, controversial, whatever we can anyway, we can have a conversation from here on out. Thanks very much.